Her daughter erased her life with paperwork, so she disappeared into the snow and rebuilt something no one expected. The day Margaret Hale was told she no longer had a home, the world didn't end with shouting. It ended quietly, across a table with signatures and silence. Weeks later, she stood before a frozen mansion buried in Wisconsin snow, her German shepherd at her side, the wind howling through empty halls. What she built inside those walls would change everything. If you lost everything in a single afternoon, would you fight to get it back? Or start somewhere no one could find you? Tell me what you'd choose. The late afternoon light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Margaret Hale's living room, casting warm golden patterns across the polished hardwood floor. The house in suburban Minnesota had been her sanctuary for over 40 years, a place filled with music, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of a life devoted to family and teaching. Framed photographs lined the mantel, school concerts, holiday gatherings, and a younger Margaret seated at her piano, smiling with quiet pride. Everything in the room spoke of stability, memory, and belonging. Margaret, now 72, sat upright in her favorite armchair, her silver hair neatly pinned, her posture still graceful despite the years. Across the room, her German shepherd, Atlas, lay stretched near the window, his ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. He was aging, like her, but his watchful eyes remained sharp and loyal. The doorbell rang. Margaret rose slowly, smoothing the front of her soft blue cardigan, and opened the door to find her daughter, Elena Brooks, standing on the porch. Elena's expression was composed, almost distant, her tailored coat and brisk posture contrasting sharply with the warmth of the home behind Margaret. "Elena, you're here," Margaret said, her voice gentle but surprised. "You didn't call." "I thought it would be better to talk in person," Elena replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her tone was controlled, professional, more like a business meeting than a family visit. Atlas stood immediately, his body alert but calm, positioning himself beside Margaret. His gaze followed Elena closely as she walked into the living room and placed a structured leather folder on the coffee table. Margaret felt a faint unease. "Is everything all right?" Elena took a measured breath. "Mom, we need to discuss your living situation. I've been concerned about your safety, living alone, the stairs, the winter coming. It's not practical anymore." Margaret blinked, confused. "I've managed just fine. I've lived here for decades. This is my home." Elena opened the folder and slid a stack of documents across the table. "I've made arrangements for you to move into Silver Pines Assisted Living. It's a beautiful facility. You'll have medical staff, meals, social activities, everything you need." Margaret stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the top sheet. Legal language filled the page, formal, cold, and unmistakable. Her name, the property address, a finalized sale. "What is this?" she whispered. "The house has been sold," Elena said calmly. "We finalized it last week." The closing is complete." Margaret's breath caught in her chest. "Sold? Elena, that's not possible. I never agreed to this." "You signed a power of attorney form during your hospital stay last spring," Elena replied. "It gave me the authority to make decisions in your best interest. This was the most responsible choice." The room seemed to tilt. Margaret gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles whitening. "My best interest? You sold my home? Without even telling me?" Atlas stepped closer, pressing gently against Margaret's leg, sensing the shift in her breathing, the tremor in her voice. "Elena," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "this house is my life. Your father and I built our memories here. I taught piano lessons in that room. I watched you grow up under this roof." Elena's expression tightened, but she did not look away. "Memories don't keep you safe, Mom. The facility is ready for you. They're expecting you tomorrow." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. The ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded unbearably loud. Margaret looked around slowly. The piano in the corner, the worn armchair by the window, the photographs that told the story of her entire adult life. Every object held a piece of her identity. And now, with a few signatures and a quiet transaction, it had all been taken from her. You've made me a stranger in my own life, Margaret said softly. Elena's gaze flickered, but her voice remained firm. I've made sure you'll be taken care of. Atlas let out a low, protective rumble, not aggressive, but unmistakably disapproving. Elena shifted uncomfortably. Margaret straightened, a quiet dignity rising through her grief. Then there's nothing more to discuss. She rose and walked slowly toward the hallway. In the bedroom, she opened her closet and retrieved a small suitcase. She packed only what she needed: a few changes of clothes, a framed photo of her late husband, and a worn sheet of music she had loved since her teaching days. Her movements were calm, deliberate, each action steady despite the storm within her. Atlas followed closely, never leaving her side. When Margaret returned to the living room, suitcase in hand, Elena looked startled. You don't have to leave tonight. You can stay until tomorrow morning. Margaret shook her head gently. This stopped being my home the moment you sold it. She paused at the doorway, her eyes lingering on the familiar space one last time. The sunlight had faded, and the room was now bathed in the cool blue of early evening. It felt distant already, like a memory slipping away. Atlas stepped forward first, then turned to look at her, waiting. Margaret placed her hand on his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. Together, they walked out the front door, leaving behind the house that had once defined her life. As the door closed softly behind her, the quiet suburban street stretched ahead, cold, unfamiliar, and uncertain. Margaret Hale stood on the sidewalk with only a suitcase, a loyal German shepherd, and a heart heavy with betrayal. For the first time in decades, she had nowhere to belong. And yet, somewhere deep within the shock and heartbreak, a faint, unspoken resolve began to stir. The night air was sharp and unforgiving as Margaret Hale stood on the sidewalk, as the porch light behind her casting a long, lonely shadow. The quiet suburban street that once felt safe now seemed distant and unfamiliar. Atlas pressed close to her side, his warm presence a steady anchor in the cold. With a final glance at the house that had held her memories for decades, Margaret turned away and walked toward her car parked at the curb. The drive felt surreal. Streetlights blurred past as tears welled in her eyes, but she kept her focus on the road. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at her, his calm vigilance offering silent reassurance. After several miles, Margaret pulled into a modest roadside motel just off the highway. A simple, aging building with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. Inside the small office, a weary clerk handed her a key without asking questions. 8 minutes later, Margaret and Atlas stepped into a narrow room with faded floral wallpaper, a single bed, and a humming heater that struggled against the chill. It was far from the warmth of her former home, but it was shelter. Margaret set her suitcase down on the worn carpet and sank onto the edge of the bed. The silence was heavy, broken only by the low rumble of the heater and the occasional passing car outside. Atlas rested his head gently on her knee, his eyes filled with quiet concern. Margaret ran her fingers through his thick fur, drawing comfort from the familiar rhythm. I suppose it's just you and me now, she whispered. After a long moment, Margaret rose and opened her suitcase. She began sorting through the few belongings she had brought, clothes neatly folded, a framed photograph of her late husband, and a small wooden box she hadn't opened in years. The box had once belonged to her teaching days, a place where she kept letters from students, concert programs, and mementos from a life filled with music and purpose. Curiosity stirred as she lifted the lid. Inside were carefully preserved envelopes, yellowed with age. As she sifted through them, one envelope stood out, thicker, sealed, and addressed in elegant, familiar handwriting. Margaret's breath caught. Margaret Hale, it read, written in flowing script she instantly recognized. The return name at the corner made her heart skip. Professor Harold Whitaker. Harold Whitaker had been more than a colleague. He was a mentor, a dear friend, and a quiet admirer of her dedication to music education. Years ago, before his passing, they had shared countless conversations about creativity, his legacy, and the importance of leaving something meaningful behind. With trembling fingers, Margaret broke the seal. Inside was a carefully folded letter and a formal document. She unfolded the letter first. Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means life has taken an unexpected turn. I have always admired your strength, compassion, and unwavering spirit. There may come a day when you need a place to begin again, a place untouched by disappointment and filled with possibility. Enclosed is the deed to Frosthaven Manor, an estate nestled in the northern woods of Wisconsin. It has stood empty for years, waiting for the right person to bring it back to life. I believe that person is you. May this place offer you peace, purpose, and the freedom to create once more. With deep respect and friendship, as Harold Whitaker. Margaret's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. Her eyes moved to the official document beneath it, a property deed bearing her name. Frosthaven Manor, northern Wisconsin. She sat in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery settling slowly over her. Only hours ago, she had been cast out of her home, stripped of the life she had built. And now, in the quiet solitude of a modest motel room, a door she never knew existed had quietly opened. Atlas lifted his head, watching her closely. Margaret looked at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. Well, she said softly, her voice steadier than she expected. It seems we may not be as lost as I thought. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot glistened under the glow of a single street lamp, and beyond it stretched the dark ribbon of highway leading into the unknown. The thought of traveling to a remote, abandoned estate in the depths of winter was daunting. Yet, compared to the emptiness she had felt earlier that evening, the idea carried a quiet promise. Margaret returned to the bed, carefully folding the letter and placing it back into the envelope alongside the deed. She set them gently on the nightstand, as if they were fragile keys to a future she had yet to imagine. Atlas jumped onto the bed and curled beside her, his steady breathing filling the small room with a sense of calm. Margaret lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed the events of the day. The shock, the betrayal, the painful farewell. But now, woven into those memories was something new, a destination, a possibility, and a chance to reclaim control over her life. The uncertainty remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into a quiet resolve. As the heater hummed and the night deepened, Margaret closed her eyes, holding on to the image of a distant mansion waiting beneath a blanket of snow, silent, forgotten, and perhaps, like her, waiting for a new beginning. Morning would bring decisions, roads, and risks. But for the first time since leaving her home, Margaret felt the faint stirrings of direction. And this time, she would choose her own path. Dawn arrived quietly, pale light filtering through the thin motel curtains and casting a soft glow across the small room. Margaret Hale opened her eyes slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The gentle rise and fall of Atlas's breathing beside her grounded her in the present. For a brief second, the events of the previous day felt like a distant dream, until the sight of the sealed envelope on the nightstand brought everything rushing back. Margaret sat up, her joints stiff but her mind clear. She reached for the letter from Professor Harold Whitaker, reading it once more. The words felt different in the morning light, less like a shock and more like an invitation. Frosthaven Manor, northern Wisconsin, a place waiting for her. Atlas stretched and rose, his tail giving a slow, encouraging wag. Margaret smiled faintly. All right, my friend, she said softly. Let's see where this road leads. Within the hour, Margaret checked out of the motel. The morning air was crisp and biting, carrying the scent of frost and pine. She loaded her suitcase into the trunk of her modest sedan, carefully placing the envelope containing the deed and letter in the glove compartment. Atlas settled into the passenger seat, alert and composed, as if he understood the importance of the journey ahead. The highway stretched out before them, a long ribbon of asphalt cutting through snow-dusted fields and quiet towns. As the miles passed, the suburban landscape gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. Snowbanks grew taller along the roadside, and the sky turned a muted gray, heavy with winter's presence. Margaret drove in silence, the rhythmic hum of the tires and the soft whoosh of the heater filling the car. Occasionally, she glanced at Atlas, who remained watchful, his ears perked and eyes scanning the passing scenery. The isolation of the journey stirred a mix of apprehension and determination within her. She had never ventured this far alone, especially not under such uncertain circumstances. By midday, the roads narrowed, and the signs of civilization became sparse. Gas stations and diners grew few and far between. Margaret stopped at a small, weathered convenience store in a quiet town to refuel and gather supplies: bottled water, canned soup, crackers, and a thick wool blanket. The store clerk, a kindly older man, gave her a curious but friendly nod as Atlas waited patiently by her side. "Headed up north?" he asked casually. "Yes," Margaret replied, "to a place called Frosthaven Manor." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That old place? Been empty for years. Folks say it's frozen solid most winters, but it's a sturdy building. Built to last." Margaret offered a polite smile, his words both unsettling and oddly reassuring. She thanked him and returned to the car, her resolve quietly strengthening. As the afternoon wore on, the road became a winding path through towering pines heavy with snow. The sky darkened earlier than expected, and a gentle snowfall began, dusting the windshield with delicate flakes. Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her focus sharpening as the conditions grew more challenging. Finally, a narrow, nearly hidden turnoff appeared, marked by a weathered wooden sign barely visible beneath layers of frost. "Frosthaven Manor," it read in faded lettering. Margaret slowed the car and turned onto the snow-covered drive. The tires crunched over packed snow as the path led deeper into the forest. The trees parted gradually, revealing a wide clearing, and there, standing in silent grandeur, was the mansion. Frosthaven Manor rose from the snow like a forgotten monument. Its tall windows were rimmed with ice, and its grand facade was draped in frost and icicles that glistened in the fading light. The structure was vast and imposing, yet elegant, with intricate stonework and sweeping architectural lines that spoke of a time when it had been vibrant and full of life. Margaret brought the car to a slow stop, her breath catching in awe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Atlas sat upright, his gaze fixed on the mansion. Without hesitation, he nudged the car door with his nose. Margaret stepped out into the crisp, silent air, the cold biting at her cheeks. The world around them was utterly still, as if the mansion had been waiting in quiet patience. The main entrance was buried beneath a heavy drift of snow, but Atlas moved with purpose, trotting along the side of the house. Margaret followed carefully, her boots crunching in the snow. Around the back, they found a smaller, sheltered door partially cleared by wind and time. Atlas pawed gently at the base of the door, then looked back at Margaret, his eyes bright and certain. "You found us a way in, didn't you?" she said, a hint of warmth returning to her voice. With some effort, Margaret brushed away the snow and grasped the cold metal handle. It resisted at first, then gave with a low, echoing creak. The door opened into a dim but surprisingly intact interior space. The air was cold, but not lifeless. Covered furniture, stacked firewood, and dust-free surfaces suggested that the mansion had been carefully preserved, waiting in silence. Margaret stepped inside, Atlas close at her side. The vastness of the place no longer felt intimidating. Instead, it carried a quiet promise of shelter, of purpose, and of something yet to be discovered. As the door closed behind them, shutting out the cold wind, Margaret felt a subtle shift within herself. The uncertainty remained, but it was now accompanied by a growing sense of determination. She had arrived at Frosthaven Manor, and the journey that began in loss had just led her to a place where possibility stood frozen in time, waiting to be awakened. She had arrived at Frosthaven Manor, and the journey that began in loss had just led her to a place where possibility stood frozen in time, waiting to be awakened. The heavy door closed behind Margaret with a hollow echo that seemed to travel through the vast interior of the mansion. The sudden stillness was almost overwhelming. The air inside was frigid, carrying the faint scent of aged wood and stone, but it was clean, untouched by decay. Frost traced delicate patterns along the tall windows, and the fading daylight filtered through them in pale blue streaks. Margaret stood just inside the entrance hall, her breath visible in the cold air. Atlas stepped forward with quiet confidence, his paws soft against the marble floor. His presence eased the tension in her chest. She rested a hand on his back, drawing strength from his calm steadiness. The grand foyer stretched upward to a high, vaulted ceiling. A sweeping staircase curved elegantly along one wall, its banister polished beneath a thin layer of dust. Covered furniture lined the edges of the room, draped in white sheets that gave the space a ghostly, frozen-in-time appearance. Yet nothing felt abandoned. It felt paused. Margaret took a cautious step forward. Her boots echoed gently, the sound grounding her in the vastness. She moved toward a large fireplace at the far end of the hall. To her surprise, neatly stacked firewood sat beside it, along with a box of matches sealed in a tin container. "Well," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "Someone believed this place would be used again." Kneeling carefully, Margaret arranged a few logs in the hearth. Her hands, though slightly trembling from the cold, moved with familiar precision. She struck a match. The small flame flickered, then caught, slowly spreading warmth and light. Within minutes, the fire began to crackle, casting a golden glow across the cold stone walls. Atlas settled near the hearth, stretching out with a contented sigh. The warmth began to chase away the biting chill, and with it, the fear that had quietly followed Margaret since she stepped inside. She walked through the adjoining rooms, exploring cautiously. The dining room held a long wooden table set with simple, dust-free place settings, as if a meal had once been planned but never served. The kitchen, though old-fashioned, was remarkably intact. Shelves held preserved cookware, and a large cast-iron stove stood ready for use. In a side pantry, she found canned goods, dried herbs, and sealed containers, evidence of careful preparation long ago. "This place wasn't forgotten," Margaret whispered, a sense of wonder replacing her earlier unease. As evening settled outside, the mansion grew quieter, the firelight dancing across the walls and ceilings. Margaret returned to the foyer and carried one of the covered armchairs closer to the fireplace. She removed the sheet, revealing rich upholstery in deep burgundy, still in excellent condition. Sitting down, she let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Atlas lifted his head and rested his chin on her knee. She stroked his fur, the simple act bringing comfort and familiarity in an unfamiliar place. "I know it looks daunting," she said softly, glancing around the vast hall, "but it doesn't feel hostile. It feels patient." Outside, the wind began to whisper through the trees, brushing softly against the mansion's stone walls. The sound was steady but not threatening, like a distant lullaby. Margaret rose and secured the doors and windows as best she could, reassured by the solid construction of the building. The thick walls and sturdy frames held firm against the cold. She chose a nearby sitting room for the night, smaller, more intimate, with a second fireplace and heavy curtains that helped trap the growing warmth. After lighting another fire, she unrolled the wool blanket she had purchased earlier and placed it over a wide, cushioned sofa. Atlas circled once before lying down beside it, ever watchful yet relaxed. Margaret sat quietly, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft rhythm of Atlas's breathing. The fear that had gripped her upon arrival had softened into a cautious sense of security. The mansion, though vast and silent, no longer felt like an intimidating relic. It felt like a refuge waiting to be revived. She looked around the room, the sturdy furniture, the preserved details, the quiet dignity of a place built to endure. A subtle warmth filled her chest, not just from the fire, but from the realization that she had found shelter on her own terms. As the night deepened, Margaret lay down on the sofa, pulling the blanket snugly around her. Atlas rested close, his presence a steady reassurance in the quiet darkness. The mansion creaked occasionally, the natural sounds of an old structure settling into the cold, but nothing felt threatening. Instead, it felt alive in a quiet, reassuring way. Margaret closed her eyes, her mind no longer consumed by loss, but gently anchored in the present moment. For the first time since leaving her home, she did not feel displaced. She felt safe. The frozen mansion, once an imposing mystery, had begun to reveal its true nature, not as a ruin, but as a sanctuary waiting to be warmed by life again. And on that first night, surrounded by silence, firelight, and the unwavering loyalty of Atlas, Margaret Hale found the courage to rest within the heart of the frozen giant. The frozen mansion, once an imposing mystery, had begun to reveal its true nature, not as a ruin, but as a sanctuary waiting to be warmed by life again. And on that first night, surrounded by silence, firelight, and the unwavering loyalty of Atlas, Margaret Hale found the courage to rest within the heart of the frozen giant. Morning arrived with a pale winter glow filtering through the frost-laced windows. Margaret awoke to the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace and the steady warmth of Atlas curled beside her. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the quiet hush of the snow-covered world outside. The fear that had once weighed heavily on her chest had eased, replaced by a calm sense of purpose. She rose slowly, wrapping the wool blanket around her shoulders, and walked toward the window. Outside, Frosthaven Manor stood in majestic silence beneath a blanket of untouched snow. The sight stirred something deep within her, a quiet determination that this place, like her own life, would not remain frozen. "Let's get to work," she said softly, glancing at Atlas. His ears perked up, and he stood immediately, tail swaying with quiet enthusiasm. Margaret began her day by exploring the mansion with new intent. She moved methodically from room to room, assessing what needed attention. In the kitchen, she found the cast-iron stove still functional. With careful effort, she lit a small fire beneath it and warmed a simple meal of canned soup. The rising steam and gentle heat transformed the room into a space of comfort rather than survival. Atlas followed closely as Margaret ventured down a long corridor where the floorboards creaked under the weight of time. At one point, Atlas paused, letting out a low, cautionary sound. Margaret stepped carefully and discovered a weakened section of the floor hidden beneath a rug. She nodded gratefully at him. "Good catch, Atlas. Looks like you're my safety inspector now." With growing confidence, Margaret gathered tools she found neatly stored in a utility room: an old snow shovel, a sturdy broom, plus a toolbox filled with well-maintained hand tools. Each item felt like a quiet promise left behind by someone who had believed this mansion would one day be restored. Stepping outside, Margaret braced herself against the cold. The crisp air stung her cheeks, but the sight of sunlight glinting off the snow filled her with energy. She began clearing a path from the back entrance, each deliberate movement warming her body and strengthening her resolve. Atlas trotted beside her, occasionally bounding through the snow with playful bursts of energy that brought a faint smile to her face. The work was slow and demanding, but with every shovelful of snow, Margaret felt a piece of her confidence return. She was no longer reacting to loss. She was creating something new. Inside, she focused on restoring warmth and order. She opened curtains to let in light, dusted surfaces that had waited years to be touched, and rearranged furniture to create a more livable space. The once silent rooms began to echo with the gentle sounds of movement, purpose, and life. In one of the smaller sitting rooms, Margaret discovered a set of thick wool blankets neatly folded inside a cedar chest. The faint scent of aged wood and lavender filled the air as she lifted them. She draped them over chairs and sofas, transforming the room into a cozy refuge from the winter outside. Atlas proved indispensable throughout the day. He guided her to a storage area stocked with lanterns and spare batteries, and later nudged open a partially stuck door that revealed a closet filled with cleaning supplies and preserved linens. And each discovery felt less like chance and more like a quiet partnership between them. By late afternoon, the mansion no longer felt dormant. Fires burned steadily in 2 fireplaces, pathways were cleared, and a sense of warmth began to spread through the once frozen halls. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny sparks of renewal. Margaret paused in the grand foyer, looking around at the subtle but meaningful changes. The space felt brighter, more alive. She placed her hand on the polished banister of the sweeping staircase, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. "I may have lost my home," she said quietly, "but I haven't lost my strength." Atlas sat beside her, his posture proud and attentive, as if acknowledging her declaration. As evening approached, Margaret returned to the kitchen to prepare a simple meal. The warmth from the stove filled the room, and the gentle glow of lantern light softened the shadows along the walls. Outside, the sky shifted into hues of deep blue and silver as the sun dipped below the snow-covered tree line. After dinner, Margaret walked through the rooms she had worked on, her steps steady and assured. The mansion, though still vast and partially untouched, now held pockets of warmth and comfort. It was no longer an overwhelming expanse. It was becoming a home. She settled once more in the sitting room by the fire, Atlas resting at her feet. The flames flickered softly, reflecting in the windows that now framed a peaceful winter night. Margaret leaned back, a quiet sense of fulfillment settling within her. What had begun as a desperate search for shelter had transformed into a mission. Each task completed, each room revived, was a step toward reclaiming her independence and dignity. The frozen mansion was no longer just a refuge, it was a canvas. And with steady hands, unwavering resolve, and the loyal companionship of Atlas, Margaret Hale had begun the work of bringing it back to life. For the first time since her world had been upended, she felt not just safe, but purposeful. The frozen mansion was no longer just a refuge, it was a canvas. And with steady hands, unwavering resolve, and the loyal companionship of Atlas, Margaret Hale had begun the work of bringing it back to life. For the first time since her world had been upended, she felt not just safe, but purposeful. A few days later, a soft winter light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the grand corridors Margaret had begun to restore. The air inside Frosthaven Manor was no longer biting cold. Instead, it carried the comforting scent of burning wood and polished surfaces. Margaret moved through the halls with growing confidence, her footsteps steady, her eyes attentive to every detail that needed care. Atlas trotted ahead, his nails clicking gently against the hardwood floors. Suddenly, he paused near the far end of a long, quiet wing Margaret had not yet explored. His ears perked, and he let out a low, curious bark. He pawed at a section of the wall beside a tall bookshelf that seemed fixed in place. Margaret approached, intrigued. "What is it, Atlas?" she asked, brushing her fingers along the edge of the shelf. The wood felt slightly warmer there, smoother, as if it had been touched more often than the surrounding surfaces. With a gentle push, the bookshelf shifted, revealing a narrow, hidden doorway behind it. Her breath caught. "Well, I'll be—" She grasped the concealed handle and slowly pulled the door open. A faint scent of aged wood and polished brass drifted out. Inside lay a spacious, beautifully preserved room that time seemed to have forgotten. It was a music room. Soft afternoon light filtered through tall, arched windows, glinting off the polished surface of a grand piano that stood proudly at the center. Along the walls were shelves filled with sheet music, carefully organized and dust-free. Violins, cellos, and a harp rested in protective cases. The room was elegant and serene, untouched by decay, as if waiting patiently for its purpose to be fulfilled. Margaret stepped inside, her heart swelling with emotion. Her fingers trembled as she approached the piano. She gently lifted the lid and pressed a single key. A clear, resonant note filled the room, rich and warm, echoing softly through the high ceiling. Tears welled in her eyes. This was his dream," she whispered, recalling Professor Harold Whitaker's passion for music and education. Atlas sat quietly near the doorway, watching her with calm attentiveness, as though understanding the significance of the moment. Margaret noticed a sturdy wooden desk near the window. On it lay a collection of leather-bound journals and neatly stacked envelopes. She opened the top journal carefully. Inside were handwritten notes, detailed plans, sketches, and reflections in Whitaker's familiar script. But he had envisioned Frosthaven Manor as a sanctuary for artists, teachers, and students, a place where creativity could flourish far from the noise and pressures of the outside world. There were blueprints for workshops, performance spaces, and classrooms. Letters described his hope that the mansion would one day inspire others to rediscover their passions. Margaret's hands rested on the pages, her emotions shifting from wonder to profound clarity. She was not here by accident. Whitaker had believed in her, her dedication to music, her compassion for others, her quiet strength. He had entrusted her with a vision, that extended far beyond shelter. "This isn't just a house," she said softly. "It's a legacy." She moved around the room with renewed energy, opening windows to let in fresh winter light, adjusting the piano bench, and straightening the music stands. Atlas followed her, his tail swaying gently, as if sharing in her sense of purpose. Margaret sat at the piano once more. Her fingers, though slightly stiff from the cold, found their way across the keys with familiar grace. A gentle melody filled the room, soft, reflective, and filled with quiet hope. The sound carried through the hidden doorway and into the corridors beyond, breathing life into the silent mansion. For a moment, Margaret felt as though the years had fallen away. She was not a displaced widow or a woman cast out of her home. She was a teacher, a musician, a creator, standing in a space that honored everything she had dedicated her life to. As the final notes faded, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The weight of loss that had followed her since leaving her old home began to lift, replaced by a profound sense of direction. Atlas approached and rested his head gently against her arm. She smiled, brushing her fingers through his fur. "We found it, Atlas. We found the heart of this place." Margaret carefully gathered a few of Whitaker's journals and placed them on the desk, organizing them with respect and intention. She knew there was much work ahead: restoration, planning, and the gradual transformation of this hidden vision into reality. But now, the path forward was clear. As she stepped back into the hallway, the concealed door left slightly ajar. The mansion felt different. It was no longer simply a structure she was restoring. It was a living space with a purpose, a story, and a future she was meant to shape. Thus, the discovery of the hidden music room marked a turning point. Margaret was no longer just surviving or rebuilding for comfort. She was carrying forward a dream, one that aligned perfectly with her own lifelong passion. In the quiet glow of the winter afternoon, with Atlas faithfully at her side, Margaret Hale embraced the realization that Frosthaven Manor was not only her refuge, it was her calling. The discovery of the hidden music room marked a turning point. Margaret was no longer just surviving or rebuilding for comfort. She was carrying forward a dream, one that aligned perfectly with her own lifelong passion. In the quiet glow of the winter afternoon, with Atlas faithfully at her side, Margaret Hale embraced the realization that Frosthaven Manor was not only her refuge, it was her calling. A few days later, the rhythm of restoration had become part of Margaret's daily life. Each morning began with lighting the fireplaces, clearing snow from the pathways, and opening curtains to welcome the pale winter sun. The mansion, once silent and frozen, now echoed with the soft sounds of movement, purpose, and the occasional melody drifting from the hidden music room. One crisp morning, as Margaret shoveled a fresh layer of snow from the back entrance, Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood alert, and he let out a low, curious bark. Margaret paused, leaning on the shovel, and listened. In the distance, the faint rumble of an engine broke the stillness of the forest. A pickup truck slowly emerged along the snow-covered drive, its tires crunching steadily as it approached the mansion. The vehicle came to a stop near the clearing, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, bundled in a heavy flannel jacket and wool cap. He raised a hand in a friendly gesture. "Morning," he called out. "Didn't expect to see anyone living up here." Margaret set the shovel aside and walked forward cautiously, Atlas staying close but calm. "Good morning," she replied. "I'm Margaret Hale. I've recently taken ownership of Frosthaven Manor." The man's expression shifted from surprise to admiration as he looked at the cleared pathways and the faint smoke rising from the chimneys. "Well, I'll be. Name's Liam Carter. I live about 10 miles down the road. I'm a carpenter by trade. Been passing this place for years. Never thought I'd see it come back to life." Margaret smiled modestly. "It's a work in progress. There's still a lot to be done." Liam glanced at the sturdy structure, nodding thoughtfully. "You've made a good start. This place was built with solid craftsmanship. With the right care, it'll stand strong for another 100 years. Atlas approached Liam cautiously, sniffing his hand before relaxing. Liam chuckled softly. "Smart dog. He's got good instincts." Before Margaret could respond, another vehicle appeared at the end of the drive, a compact car carefully navigating the snowy path. It stopped a short distance away, and a young woman stepped out, bundled in a thick coat, a camera hanging from her neck, and a portfolio case in hand. She approached with a mix of excitement and curiosity. "Hi. I'm so sorry if I'm intruding. My name is Sophie Nguyen. I'm an architecture student, and I've been researching historic estates in this region. I heard rumors that Frosthaven Manor might finally be occupied, so I had to see it for myself." Margaret exchanged a glance with Liam, both amused by the unexpected gathering. "You're not intruding," Margaret said warmly. "I'm Margaret Hale. This is Atlas." Sophie's eyes lit up as she took in the mansion's facade, the cleared pathways, and the subtle signs of restoration. "This is incredible. The structure is remarkably well preserved. The stonework, the symmetry, the detailing. It's a masterpiece of early 20th century design." Liam nodded in agreement. "She's got a good eye. This place was built by craftsmen who took pride in their work." Margaret felt a gentle warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since arriving, she was not alone in seeing the mansion's potential. "I recently discovered a hidden music room inside," she shared. "It was part of the original owner's vision to turn this place into a creative sanctuary." Sophie's face lit up with excitement. "That's extraordinary. If you're open to it, I'd love to help document the restoration. It could become an important historical and cultural site." "And I'd be happy to lend a hand with repairs," Liam added. "No charge to start, just neighborly support. This place deserves to shine again." Margaret looked from Liam to Sophie, deeply moved by their generosity. Just days ago, she had felt cast aside and alone. Now, standing in the snow-covered clearing, she found herself surrounded by kindness and shared purpose. "I would be grateful for your help," she said sincerely. "There's so much to do. Oh, and it means a great deal to know others believe in this place too." The three of them walked toward the mansion together, Atlas trotting happily between them. Inside, Margaret led them through the restored rooms. Liam examined the structure with a practiced eye, pointing out areas where reinforcement would ensure long-term stability. Sophie photographed architectural details, her enthusiasm bringing a fresh energy into the space. When they entered the hidden music room, both visitors fell silent in awe. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the grand piano and the carefully preserved instruments. "This is breathtaking," Sophie whispered, capturing the moment with her camera. Liam ran a hand along the polished wood of the piano. "You can feel the history in this room." Margaret sat at the piano bench and played a gentle melody. The notes filled the space, warm and resonant, weaving a sense of unity among them. Atlas lay quietly nearby, content and watchful. By the time the sun began to set, plans were already taking shape. Repairs to strengthen the roof, careful restoration of original features, and documentation to preserve the mansion's story. What had once been a solitary effort was now a shared mission. As Liam prepared to leave, he tipped his cap. "You've got something special here, Margaret, and you're not alone in bringing it back." Sophie smiled warmly. "This place is going to inspire so many people. I'm honored to be part of its revival." Margaret stood at the entrance, watching as their vehicles disappeared down the snowy drive. Now the fading light cast a golden glow across the restored pathways and the towering silhouette of Frosthaven Manor. Atlas sat beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of connection and hope. The mansion was no longer just a personal refuge or a hidden legacy. It was becoming a place where lives, talents, and stories would come together. Inside the once frozen walls, warmth, collaboration, and purpose had taken root. And for the first time since her world had changed, Margaret felt not only strong, but supported. The journey of restoration had transformed from a solitary struggle into a shared dream, carried forward by new friendships and the enduring spirit of Frosthaven Manor. Inside the once frozen walls, warmth, collaboration, and purpose had taken root. And for the first time since her world had changed, Margaret felt not only strong, but supported. The journey of restoration had transformed from a solitary struggle into a shared dream, carried forward by new friendships and the enduring spirit of Frosthaven Manor. But winter was not finished with them yet. The sky darkened earlier than usual that afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in like a slow-moving curtain across the horizon. The air grew sharper, the wind rising with a low, steady howl that swept across the open clearing. Margaret stood by the tall window in the main hall, watching as the first thick flakes of snow began to fall. Atlas paced near the door, restless and alert. His ears twitched at every gust of wind rattling the window panes. "This one feels different," Margaret murmured, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Which by early evening, the snowfall had intensified into a full blizzard. The wind roared around Frosthaven Manor, hurling snow against the walls in relentless waves. Visibility outside vanished into a swirling white haze. The world beyond the mansion disappeared, leaving them isolated in a storm that seemed determined to test every inch of the structure and every ounce of Margaret's resolve. Liam had left earlier that afternoon, promising to return once the weather cleared. Sophie had postponed her next visit, warned by local forecasts of the incoming storm. Now Margaret and Atlas faced the fury of winter alone. Inside, the fires burned steadily in the fireplaces, casting warm light across the rooms. Yet the storm's intensity soon made itself known. A sudden flicker of the overhead lights signaled a power fluctuation. Moments later, as the electricity went out entirely, plunging the mansion into darkness. Margaret paused, her heart pounding in the sudden silence. Atlas moved closer, pressing against her leg. His calm presence steadied her. "It's all right," she said softly, more to reassure herself than him. "We're prepared." She retrieved lanterns and batteries from the storage closet Atlas had helped her discover days earlier. One by one, she lit the lanterns, placing them strategically throughout the main living areas. Their warm glow pushed back the darkness, restoring a sense of safety. As the wind howled louder, a faint, troubling sound reached Margaret's ears, a dull thumping echoing through the walls. She followed the noise toward the kitchen, Atlas at her side. The sound grew clearer near the chimney. Atlas barked sharply, Anna then scratched at the base of the wall near the hearth. Margaret examined the area closely and noticed a faint trail of soot and a subtle draft. Realization dawned on her. "The chimney," she said under her breath. "It must be partially blocked. If left unchecked, the blockage could cause smoke to build up inside. A dangerous situation, especially with the fires burning continuously for warmth." Without hesitation, Margaret put on her heavy coat, gloves, and hat. She secured a lantern and carefully made her way to the back entrance. The door resisted against the force of the wind, but with effort, she pushed it open. A blast of icy air and swirling snow greeted her, nearly stealing her breath. Atlas stood firmly beside her, his posture protective and unwavering. Step by step, Margaret navigated through the blinding snow toward the side of the house where the chimney rose along the stone wall. Snowdrifts pressed heavily against the structure, and ice had formed near the chimney cap. With steady determination, she used a long-handled brush and metal rod from the utility shed to dislodge the packed snow and debris. The wind howled around her, but she pressed on, guided by necessity and resolve. After several tense minutes, the blockage gave way. A rush of warm smoke escaped upward into the stormy sky, carried away by the fierce wind. Breathing heavily, Margaret returned inside, her cheeks flushed and her hands trembling from the cold. Atlas followed closely, shaking off snow before settling near the fireplace once more. Within minutes, the troubling sounds ceased. The fires burned cleanly, and the air inside the mansion remained safe and warm. Margaret sank into a chair near the hearth, exhaustion washing over her. Atlas rested his head on her knee, his steady presence a silent reassurance. "You knew something was wrong," she said, gently stroking his fur. "You kept us safe." The storm raged on through the night, shaking windows and blanketing the world outside in thick layers of snow. Yet inside Frosthaven Manor, the fires continued to burn, the lanterns glowed steadily, and the walls stood firm against the relentless wind. Margaret moved from room to room, checking windows, reinforcing doors, and ensuring the fires remained strong. Each task she completed reinforced her confidence. The mansion was not fragile. It was resilient. And so was she. By the early hours of the morning, the storm began to subside, while the wind softened and the snowfall eased into a gentle drift. Margaret stood at the window as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, revealing a transformed landscape. The clearing was buried under deep snow, but Frosthaven Manor stood tall and unshaken. A quiet sense of triumph filled her chest. They had endured the storm, not just survived it, but faced it with courage, preparation, and trust. Atlas stood beside her, his tail wagging slowly as he gazed out at the peaceful, snow-covered world. Margaret placed her hand on the windowpane, feeling the faint warmth from within contrasting with the frozen silence outside. The mansion had proven its strength, and in the heart of the storm, so had she. This trial had forged a deeper bond between Margaret and the place she now called home. Frosthaven Manor was no longer simply being restored. It had become a steadfast partner in her journey. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the pristine snow, Margaret knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer the woman who had left her home in despair. She was stronger now, and Frosthaven Manor stood with her, unyielding against the fiercest winter could offer. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the pristine snow, Margaret knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer the woman who had left her home in despair. She was stronger now, and Frosthaven Manor stood with her, unyielding against the fiercest winter could offer. In the days that followed the blizzard, the mansion seemed to breathe with renewed life. Sunlight streamed through newly cleared windows and illuminating rooms that had once been dim and silent. The snow outside remained deep, but inside warmth and purpose filled every corner. Margaret moved through the halls with quiet confidence, her steps steady, her eyes alive with intention. Liam returned as soon as the roads were passable, his truck cutting a determined path through the lingering snowbanks. He stepped inside with a broad smile, stamping the cold from his boots. "I had a feeling this place would still be standing strong," he said, glancing around at the glowing fireplaces and orderly rooms. "And it looks even better than before the storm." Sophie arrived later that day, her camera ready, her excitement unmistakable. She paused in the grand foyer, her eyes widening at the transformation. "It's incredible," she said softly. "There's a warmth here now, something alive. Oh, you can feel it." Margaret welcomed them both with genuine gratitude. The challenges of the storm had strengthened her resolve, and now, with her allies back by her side, the work took on a new rhythm, faster, more purposeful, and deeply fulfilling. They focused their efforts on the heart of the mansion, the hidden music room. Margaret carefully cleaned the piano, polishing its surface until it reflected the soft glow of the afternoon light. Sophie documented every detail, capturing before and after images that told the story of renewal. Liam repaired subtle structural issues, ensuring the room's acoustics and stability would endure for years to come. One afternoon, after weeks of steady work, Margaret sat at the piano and played a full piece for the first time since arriving. The melody flowed through the room, rich, warm, and filled with emotion. The notes drifted beyond the hidden doorway and into the surrounding halls, filling Frosthaven Manor with a sense of joy and awakening. Liam leaned against the doorway, listening quietly. "That sound," he said, "makes this place feel like it's truly alive again." Sophie lowered her camera, visibly moved. "People need to hear this. They need to see what you've done here." Encouraged by their support, Margaret began to envision the mansion not just as a restored home, but as a place of gathering and inspiration. She arranged seating in the music room, set up stands for instruments, and created a welcoming space where creativity could flourish. The transformation was no longer subtle, it was radiant. Word began to spread in nearby towns. A local shop owner mentioned the restored mansion to customers, but a delivery driver spoke of the warm lights glowing from Frosthaven's windows at dusk. Curiosity grew, and soon a few respectful visitors began to arrive. Neighbors, artists, and retirees drawn by the story of a once-frozen mansion coming back to life. Margaret greeted each visitor with warmth and humility. She shared the history of the house, Professor Whitaker's vision, and the collective effort that had brought the mansion back from silence. Atlas, ever the gentle guardian, welcomed guests with calm friendliness, quickly becoming a beloved presence. As winter gradually loosened its grip, subtle signs of spring began to appear. Icicles melted into steady drips, and patches of earth emerged beneath the snow. Inside, the mansion thrived with activity. The music room hosted small, intimate gatherings where Margaret played piano. Oh, and visitors shared stories, laughter, and creative ideas. Standing in the grand foyer one afternoon, Margaret looked around at the transformed space. The polished floors, the glowing fireplaces, the soft hum of conversation drifting from the music room. The mansion was no longer a relic of the past. It was vibrant, welcoming, and filled with purpose. Atlas sat beside her, his posture relaxed yet attentive. Margaret rested her hand gently on his head, her heart full. "This place," she said quietly, "has given me more than shelter. It's given me a reason to begin again." The journey from heartbreak to renewal had taken shape in every restored room, every shared moment, and every note that echoed through the halls. Frosthaven Manor had become a living testament to resilience and vision, a place where the frozen silence of the past had given way to warmth, creativity, and connection. And as the first true breeze of spring carried the scent of thawing earth through the open windows, Margaret knew that the mansion's transformation was not just complete. It was only the beginning of something extraordinary. The journey from heartbreak to renewal had taken shape in every restored room, every shared moment, and every note that echoed through the halls. Frosthaven Manor had become a living testament to resilience and vision, a place where the frozen silence of the past had given way to warmth, creativity, and connection. And as the first true breeze of spring carried the scent of thawing earth through the open windows. But Margaret knew that the mansion's transformation was not just complete. It was only the beginning of something extraordinary. She did not expect her daughter to be part of it. The message arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Margaret had just finished arranging fresh-cut branches in tall glass vases along the foyer table when her phone vibrated, a device she had barely used since leaving Minnesota. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't seen in weeks: Elena. Margaret stood still for a long moment before opening the message. "I saw something online. Is this really you? At Frosthaven Manor?" Attached was a link to a short local feature posted by Sophie, a series of photographs and a brief article titled, "From Frozen to Flourishing, the Woman Who Brought Frosthaven Back to Life." Margaret's fingers hovered over the screen. Atlas lifted his head from the rug, sensing the shift in her breathing. "Yes," she murmured quietly. "It's really me." She replied simply, "Yes, I'm here." The response came faster than she expected. "I'm driving up tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and cool. The snow had melted into gentle streams along the edges of the property, and the once frozen landscape was beginning to show hints of green. Margaret stood on the veranda, hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the long drive stretch toward the forest line. Atlas sat at her side, alert but calm. When the black SUV appeared at the far end of the drive, Margaret's heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from anticipation. Elena stepped out, dressed in a tailored spring coat, sunglasses shielding her expression. Once she paused when she saw the mansion fully for the first time in daylight. The cleaned stone exterior gleamed softly under the sun. Flower boxes lined the windows. The once buried path was now neatly maintained. Elena removed her sunglasses slowly. "You did all this?" she asked, walking toward the house. Margaret met her halfway across the clearing. "Not alone," she replied calmly. "But yes." Elena's eyes scanned the building, the gardens, the open windows where faint music drifted out. "It doesn't look anything like the pictures I saw before," Elena admitted. "It didn't look like this when I arrived either," Margaret said gently. They stepped inside together. The grand foyer was warm and bright, sunlight reflecting off polished wood floors. The air carried the faint scent of lemon oil and fresh flowers. And from the music room down the hall, the soft hum of a piano recording played quietly, background music for the day's visitors. Elena turned slowly, taking it all in. "This is beautiful," she said, almost reluctantly. Margaret watched her daughter's expression carefully. There was no anger rising inside her now, only steadiness. "You sold my house because you believed I couldn't manage on my own," Margaret said evenly. "But I needed the chance to decide that for myself." Elena looked down briefly, her composure faltering. "You were alone. I thought I was protecting you." You were protecting what you thought was safe, Margaret replied. But safety without dignity isn't living. Atlas approached Elena quietly, sniffing her hand before settling back beside Margaret. The simple gesture broke some of the tension in the air, and Elena exhaled slowly. I saw the article. People are talking about this place. About you. Margaret smiled faintly. They're talking about the mansion. I just gave it a second chance. They walked together toward the hidden music room. When Margaret pushed the concealed bookshelf aside, Elena's breath caught as she stepped into the luminous space. The grand piano gleamed beneath the afternoon light. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. Fresh flowers decorated the windowsills. You're hosting events here? Elena asked. Small gatherings, Margaret said. Music workshops. Creative afternoons for seniors from nearby towns. It's growing. Elena moved closer to the piano, running her fingers along its polished surface. You look different. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Different how? Stronger, Elena admitted quietly. Oh, confident. Margaret considered her words. I didn't know I could do this either, she said. But sometimes being pushed out forces you to discover what you're capable of. Silence settled between them. Not cold, but reflective. Elena turned to face her fully. I was wrong not to talk to you. I should have trusted you. Margaret held her daughter's gaze. You made a decision you believed was right. But it wasn't yours to make alone. Elena's eyes softened. What happens now? Margaret glanced around the music room, sunlight glinting across the keys of the piano. Now, she said calmly, I continue building this. And if you want to be part of it, you're welcome here. Not as someone managing me, but as my daughter. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Elena nodded slowly. I'd like that. Outside, as a gentle breeze stirred through the open windows, the house no longer felt like a refuge from pain. It felt like a place of confidence and clarity. Margaret sat at the piano and began to play a gentle melody. Elena remained standing nearby, listening, not as a decision-maker, not as a guardian, but simply as a daughter. Atlas lay peacefully at Margaret's feet. For the first time since that day in the suburban living room with legal documents spread across the table, Margaret did not feel diminished in her daughter's presence. She felt equal. And as the final notes echoed softly through Frosthaven Manor, the balance of power had quietly, unmistakably shifted. She felt equal. And as the final notes echoed softly through Frosthaven Manor, the balance of power had quietly, unmistakably shifted. Her spring unfolded gently across northern Wisconsin. The heavy snowbanks receded into clear streams that traced silver paths along the property. The once frozen gardens revealed dark soil beneath, ready for new growth. Liam repaired the last of the stone edging along the walkways, while Sophie documented the transformation in careful detail, before and after, ruin and renewal. Margaret moved through the mansion with steady assurance. What had begun as survival had grown into something far larger. The music room now hosted weekly gatherings, piano recitals, poetry readings, storytelling circles for seniors who had long believed their creative days were behind them. The laughter that drifted down the halls was soft but genuine. The mansion no longer echoed with emptiness. It hummed with life. But Elena returned a week after their difficult but honest conversation. This time she did not arrive with urgency or control. She came carrying seed trays and gardening gloves. I thought the courtyard could use early blooms, she said, offering a tentative smile. Margaret handed her a trowel without hesitation. Tulips would do well near the southern wall. They'll catch the afternoon sun. They worked side by side in the warming earth, Atlas lying nearby beneath the budding maple tree. The air carried the scent of damp soil and fresh beginnings. Inside the house, volunteers from neighboring towns had begun to visit. Some were retirees eager to contribute. Others were younger artists curious about the story of the frozen mansion that had been brought back to life by a 72-year-old woman and her loyal dog. Though Sophie's feature had spread further than expected. A regional news outlet reached out for a short segment. Margaret hesitated at first, uncomfortable with attention. But Liam gently reassured her. Let people see what resilience looks like, he said. There's nothing boastful about sharing hope. The official reopening of Frosthaven Manor was planned for early May. Margaret stood on the veranda the morning of the event, sunlight spilling across freshly painted railings and newly planted flower beds. The stone facade gleamed softly. The windows reflected blue skies instead of gray storm clouds. Visitors began arriving before noon. Cars lined the drive. Couples stepped out carefully, admiring the sweeping architecture. Seniors from nearby communities approached slowly, leaning on canes or holding grandchildren's hands. Inside, the foyer was adorned with soft banners reading, Frosthaven Creative Retreat, Opening Day. The hidden music room stood at the heart of it all. Margaret had chosen to begin the afternoon with a simple piano performance. She wore a pale blue dress and a silver brooch she had once kept tucked away in a drawer in her old Minnesota home, a quiet reminder of who she had been before everything changed. Atlas rested at her side as she entered the room. Conversations hushed naturally. Elena stood near the back, helping coordinate guests with calm attentiveness, not directing, supporting. Margaret sat at the piano and placed her hand gently on the keys. The first notes floated upward, clear and steady. She did not play for applause. She played for continuity, for the dream Professor Whitaker once sketched in his journals, for the cold night she first slept inside these walls, for the storm that tested her resolve, and for the quiet moment she reclaimed her dignity. The melody grew richer as the room absorbed it. Some listeners closed their eyes. Others held hands. When she finished, there was a brief silence, then a wave of heartfelt applause. Margaret rose slowly, not out of pride but gratitude. Liam stepped forward to speak briefly about the restoration process. Sophie shared photographs of the transformation, projected onto a portable screen. The frozen facade buried in snow, the hidden music room discovered behind a bookshelf, the chimney cleared during the blizzard, the gradual return of color and warmth. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. "No one would believe it was the same place," someone whispered, and Elena watched her mother closely throughout it all. Later that afternoon, as guests wandered through the gardens and corridors, Elena approached Margaret quietly. "I didn't understand before," she admitted. "I thought stability meant control. I didn't realize how much strength you still carried." Margaret studied her daughter's face. Less guarded now, more open. "Strength doesn't disappear with age," she said gently. "It just changes form." Elena nodded. "If you'll have me, I'd like to help with organizing future events. Maybe even create outreach programs for seniors in assisted living facilities. People who might need this." Margaret smiled warmly. That would be welcome. Outside, children ran across the courtyard, their laughter rising into the clear sky. Older couples admired the restored stonework, while a retired art teacher discussed watercolor classes with Sophie near the entrance. Frosthaven Manor stood alive, no longer silent, no longer forgotten. By late afternoon, as the final guests departed, the grounds were left glowing in golden light. The tulips in the courtyard swayed gently. Freshly painted shutters caught the sunset. Margaret stood on the veranda once more, Atlas beside her, Elena just a step behind. Months earlier, the mansion had been frozen and unrecognizable beneath layers of neglect. Now visitors left speaking of its warmth, its beauty, its purpose. And as the last car disappeared down the drive, Margaret exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but fulfillment. Frosthaven Manor had been reborn, and so had she. Frosthaven Manor had been reborn, and so had she. While the weeks following the grand opening unfolded with a quiet, steady rhythm. Morning sunlight stretched across the veranda, warming the stone beneath Margaret's feet. The once barren courtyard now bloomed with tulips Elena had planted, their petals opening wide to the soft Wisconsin breeze. Margaret stood with a cup of tea in hand, Atlas resting comfortably at her side. His muzzle had begun to show more gray lately, but his eyes remained alert and loyal, scanning the grounds with calm vigilance. From inside the mansion came the gentle murmur of voices. A watercolor class was underway in the East Wing, and in the music room, a small group of retirees practiced harmonies under Margaret's patient guidance. The walls that had once held only silence now carried laughter, music, and the subtle hum of rediscovered purpose. And Elena stepped out onto the veranda, carrying a clipboard tucked against her chest. "The RSVP list for next month's retreat is already filling up," she said with quiet amazement. "We've had inquiries from neighboring counties." Margaret smiled, not with surprise but with measured pride. People are hungry for places that remind them they still matter. Elena nodded thoughtfully. "I've been speaking with a few assisted living directors. Some residents would love to attend workshops here, even just to visit." Margaret turned to look at her daughter. The tension that once defined their conversations had softened into mutual respect. Elena no longer approached her mother with assumptions about fragility. Instead, she listened. "That would be meaningful," Margaret said. "Everyone deserves to feel capable, no matter their age." A light breeze lifted the edges of Margaret's silver hair. She gazed across the property, the restored stonework, the open windows, the gardens slowly spreading with color. It was difficult to believe that only months ago she had stood in a suburban living room holding legal documents that erased her home without her consent. That moment of humiliation had felt like an ending. Now, it seemed more like a doorway. Atlas rose and padded toward the courtyard, where a small group of visitors had begun to gather for the afternoon music session. Children approached him carefully, and he greeted them with patient gentleness. Margaret watched him with affection. Through every stage, shock, loneliness, uncertainty, rebuilding, he had remained steady. Not once had he questioned the journey. He had simply walked beside her. "Elena," Margaret said softly, "do you remember how quiet my house used to be?" Elena gave a faint smile. "Yes, I thought quiet meant peaceful." Margaret looked toward the open windows, where faint piano notes drifted outward. "Peace isn't the absence of sound," she said gently. "It's the presence of purpose." Elena considered that carefully. Inside the mansion, the music session began. Margaret entered the hidden music room and took her place at the piano. Seniors sat in a semicircle, some hesitant, some eager, all present. She began with a simple melody, one she had taught countless students over decades of teaching. Slowly, voices joined in. Some were shaky at first, but confidence grew with each measure. As the final note lingered in the air, Margaret looked around the room. Faces that once carried fatigue now held animation. Eyes that had dulled with routine now shone with involvement. This was not about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about restoration of spaces, of dignity, of identity. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed and the sun dipped low behind the trees, Margaret returned to the veranda. Atlas settled beside her once more, and Elena joined them quietly. The sky shifted from gold to deep violet. "You lost your house," Elena said softly, "but you built something far bigger." Margaret rested her hand on Atlas's head. "I lost walls," she replied calmly, "but I found foundation." She reflected not on the betrayal alone, but on the strength it had uncovered. Being cast aside had not diminished her. It had revealed her capacity to rebuild. Frosthaven Manor stood behind her, illuminated by warm interior lights. Most from the outside, it bore little resemblance to the frozen structure buried beneath snow months ago. No one who saw it now would recognize what it had once been, and no one who saw Margaret standing there, steady, confident, fulfilled, would recognize the woman who had once left her home carrying only a suitcase and a wounded heart. The journey had not erased pain. It had transformed it. Margaret drew a slow breath, feeling the cool evening air against her skin. True strength, she understood now, is not proven when life is comfortable. It is revealed when comfort is taken away, and we choose to build again anyway. Purpose does not retire with age. Dignity does not fade when challenged. They wait patiently beneath the surface, ready to rise when given courage and belief.
She looked at Elena, then Atlas, then back at the low mansion. "This," she said quietly, "is warm and endures." And as the light of Frosthaven Manor shimmered against the darkening sky, Margaret Hale stood not as someone dissolved, but as someone who had reclaimed her place in the world, stronger and more alive than ever before. Sometimes life takes away the place we thought define us, only to lead us toward the place we were meant to build. Margaret didn't just restore a frozen mansion, she restored her out voice, her dignity, and a future no one else could decide for her. If you were in her position, would you have started over in the wilderness or tried to fight for the life you lost? Say your honest answer in the comments. I truly love to hear your perspective. And if story of resilience and late life reinvention move you, consider subscribing for more journey like this.